The Egungun Masquerade. When the dead walk among the living in Yoruba tradition, ancestors don't stay buried. They return in cloth and voice to judge the living and enforce cosmic law. Long before modern ghost hunting equipment sought to capture whispers from beyond, the Yoruba people of West Africa developed a technology for ancestral return that required no instruments beyond fabric, ritual knowledge, and unwavering communal belief. The Egungun Masquerade stands as perhaps the most theatrical, the most visible, and the most thoroughly documented tradition of ancestral manifestation in world religious practice. It operates on a theological premise that contradicts Western assumptions about the boundary between life and what comes after. The dead are not gone. They return, physically present, to walk the same earth their descendants occupy, to speak with authority, to heal, to punish, and to remind the community that those who came before continue to watch everything that unfolds. The masked figure that emerges during Egungun ceremonies is not a performer portraying an ancestor. According to the tradition's internal logic and the testimony of communities that maintain it across centuries, the figure is the ancestor. The person beneath the layers of cloth ceases to exist as an individual identity when the costume is donned and the ritual protocols are observed. What walks among the crowd is ancestral power made manifest, a being who occupies the threshold between worlds, dangerous to approach, impossible to ignore, and capable of exercising authority that transcends any living person's claim to power. European observers documented Egungun ceremonies as early as the 17th century, when Portuguese traders and later British colonial administrators encountered masked figures moving through Yoruba communities with a command over crowds that baffled outsiders. These early accounts describe elaborate costumes constructed from hundreds of pieces of cloth, figures whose movements seemed to defy normal human physiology, and voices that spoke in tones unrecognizable as belonging to any known individual. The pronouncements of these figures carried legal weight. Disputes that human authorities had failed to resolve would be settled when an Egungun spoke judgment. Illnesses that resisted treatment would be diagnosed and cures prescribed by ancestral knowledge channeled through the masquerade. Communities would fall silent when an Egungun appeared, not from theatrical politeness, but from genuine recognition that something beyond the ordinary had entered their presence. The costume itself functions as both container and conduit for ancestral power. Art historian Babatund Lowell's extensive documentation of Egungun traditions reveals the sacred manufacturing process behind these elaborate constructions. Specialists with lineage authority assemble costumes that may incorporate fabric from the clothing of deceased family members, creating a material link between the ancestor being invoked and the physical form that will manifest in the ceremony. Hundreds of layers of cloth are treated with herbs and ritual substances intended both to channel ancestral presence and to protect the performer from the dangerous spiritual forces moving through his body. The specific design of each costume varies by lineage, by community, and by the particular ancestral spirit being summoned. Some Egungun costumes tower above the crowd with vertical extensions that make the figure appear impossibly tall. Others move low to the ground, spinning with a velocity that seems to exceed human capability. The preparation of the performer involves protocols that acknowledge the transformation he will undergo. Prayers are recited as the costume is assembled around him, acknowledging that what will emerge is no longer the individual who entered the ritual space. Herbs protect him from the spiritual power that will move through his voice and gestures. The performer must observe specific prohibitions before and after the ceremony, maintaining ritual purity that allows him to serve as a vessel for ancestral presence without suffering spiritual harm. The tradition maintains absolute secrecy about the identity of the person beneath the costume. Revealing this identity constitutes a serious offense in communities where Egungun practice is maintained and historically carried severe social and legal consequences. The secrecy is not theatrical convention, but theological necessity, Acknowledging the human beneath the cloth would rupture the ancestral presence the ceremony creates. Lowell documented cases that challenge rational explanation. In multiple instances, he recorded Egungun figures speaking information about family disputes, community conflicts, or concealed wrongdoing that the person beneath the costume could not have known through normal means. The ancestors, present through the masquerade, revealed what the living had tried to hide. They identified sources of illness that medical practitioners had failed to diagnose. They named individuals responsible for community harms that had gone unresolved through conventional investigation. The knowledge demonstrated during these ceremonies exceeded what could be explained by the performer's research or the community's gossip networks. Something was speaking through the cloth that possessed information beyond human access. The danger associated with Egungun is both immediate and lasting. Physical contact with the costume is believed to transfer ancestral power that living bodies cannot safely contain. Handlers armed with whips attend each Egungun figure, keeping the crowd at a distance measured not in social convention but in spiritual safety. This is not symbolic protection. Nigerian communities have documented cases of individuals who fell ill after accidental contact with Egungun cloth, suffering conditions that required treatment from both medical practitioners and traditional healers who understood the spiritual dimension of the affliction. The illness manifests physically, but originates in the transfer of power from the ancestral realm into a living person unprepared to receive it. The spiritual danger extends beyond physical touch. Treating an Egungun with disrespect, laughing during ceremonies meant to be conducted in reverent silence, or otherwise failing to recognize the ancestral presence creates the conditions for retribution. Lowell documented a case from Abeokuta in which a young man mocked an Egungun performance during a community festival, treating the ceremony as entertainment rather than sacred encounter. Within 2 weeks, the young man suffered a physical collapse that defied medical explanation. The community recognized the pattern immediately, ancestral displeasure manifesting as bodily crisis. The young man's family sponsored a propitiation ceremony, working through the Egungun Society's leadership to address the ancestral offense. Community elders monitored the young man's recovery and deemed the ritual response sufficient to resolve the spiritual crisis. His health returned, following a pattern the community had seen before in cases where proper protocols restored balance between the living and the dead. When Egungun tradition itself becomes the source of spiritual disruption, when ancestors are angry because lineages have neglected their obligations, or when ceremonies have been improperly performed, resolution comes from within the tradition's own structures. The Egungun Society's chief priest consults Ifa divination, the Yoruba system of sacred knowledge, to identify the nature of ancestral grievance and the specific actions required to address it. The prescriptions vary according to the diagnosis. A lineage may need to sponsor a public propitiation ceremony. An Egungun costume may require renovation or complete replacement. New members may need initiation into the society to ensure continuity of proper practice. Specific offerings to lineage ancestors may restore the relationship that neglect or improper conduct had damaged. The tradition did not remain confined to the African continent. The Middle Passage, that forced migration of enslaved peoples across the Atlantic, carried Yoruba religious practice to the Americas, where it adapted to new environments while maintaining core theological principles. Egungun societies appeared in Cuba during the 19th century, documented by researchers who found the tradition thriving despite the violence of slavery and the pressure of colonial Christianity. In Brazil, particularly on the island of Itaparica in Bahia's Bay of All Saints, the Baba Egum tradition has been maintained with remarkable fidelity to African protocols. Brazilian and international researchers have studied the Itaparica community as one of the most intact preservation sites of Yoruba ancestral practice outside Africa, a living continuity of tradition that many assumed would not survive displacement and oppression. In recent decades, Egungun ceremonies have been established in United States cities with significant Yoruba diaspora populations. New York, Atlanta, and other urban centers now host lineage associations that maintain the tradition as part of family identity and cultural heritage. The costumes are constructed according to traditional specifications. The ceremonies follow protocols transmitted across generations. The ancestors return in Brooklyn and Georgia as they return in Lagos and Ibadan, making visible a theological claim about the persistence of relationship between the living and the dead that transcends geography. The tradition's survival through centuries of disruption demonstrates its deep embedding in Yoruba social and spiritual life. Christian missionaries consistently condemned Egungun as devil worship, attempting to replace ancestral veneration with denominational doctrine. Colonial administrators sought to suppress practices they viewed as primitive superstition incompatible with modernity. Post-colonial social upheavals created pressures toward cultural homogenization that threatened localized traditions. The Egungun persisted through all of it, maintained by communities who needed what the tradition provided. Proof that those who came before had not simply disappeared, that the knowledge and authority of ancestors remained accessible, and that the living remained accountable to standards that transcended the present moment's convenience. UNESCO's recognition of Egungun-related traditions in its intangible cultural heritage documentation acknowledges the tradition's cultural significance. The closely related Geled Masquerade tradition carries designation as a UNESCO masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. These institutional recognitions follow decades of scholarly documentation that has treated Egungun not as folklore or primitive ritual, but as sophisticated religious practice deserving serious analytical attention. What the Egungun offers observers willing to suspend Western assumptions about death and presence is a functioning technology for ancestral return that operates in communities spanning 3 continents. The dead walk among the living not as metaphor or memory, but as cloth-covered presence speaking with authority, enforcing accountability and maintaining connection between generations. The masquerade continues because communities continue to need what it provides: governance when human authorities fail, healing when conventional medicine offers no answers, and the reassurance that those who established the foundations of communal life have not abandoned their descendants to navigate the present moment alone. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.